WCNC Charlotte, this is Flashpoint.
Thanks for joining us here on Flashpoint. I'm Ben Thompson. In just the past year, get this, 300 child care centers have closed in the state of North Carolina. The result of pandemic money running dry. It's left families with few child care options. Coming up later in the show, how state lawmakers are working to save some of those centers. But first, a Charlotte congressman working in Washington to get more federal funding for those daycares. I spoke to him earlier this week. Joining us now is Congressman Jeff Jackson. Congressman, welcome back to Flashpoint. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
All right, this week you helped introduce a bill that would help families cover the cost of child care. We know that hundreds of these centers have closed in the last year here in the state and also much more across the country. Before we get to the solution, help us understand why this is happening, why it's a problem.
This is a really bad problem. I'm not sure if families, if you don't have young kids, if you're quite acquainted with how much of a crisis this has become, but particularly in certain parts of North Carolina, it's almost impossible to find childcare at this point. So when we put this bill forth, we got co-sponsors not just in North Carolina, but from across the country, because coming out of the pandemic, when we had more funding for early childhood, that funding is now drying up, which means that childcare options are going away for a lot of families. So the idea was, how can we basically just defray startup costs to increase the supply for childcare across the state and across the country?
Okay, more on that. What would your bill actually do to help sort of address this problem that's happening?
Well, one of the hurdles is the startup costs for things like cribs, playgrounds, training. So we said if we do a $5,000 refundable tax credit for family childcare facilities, once they're licensed, once everything is official, then they told us that that would help them start more family child care facilities. So that's what it's targeted for, startup costs for licensed family child care facilities.
And do you think this is going to be enough to help keep open some of these daycares that are currently struggling, or do you think this is going to help get more sort of in the pipeline?
I think this is the fastest thing that we can do that will have the biggest effect. It is not the total solution. The total solution is a state and federal government that just decides to prioritize childcare more highly than it has in the past, as we did during the pandemic when we had to keep our economy running. It would be great if childcare could keep that high level of priority that it had a few years ago.
How much of this does, you mentioned it, but how much of this does just fall back on that funding running out from COVID?
A lot, but it was a major problem even then because demand is outstripping supply, particularly in places that are growing quickly, like Mecklenburg. Demand is just through the roof and we don't have enough supply.
What do you see as, well, let me ask you this. Do you see bipartisan support for something like this? Do you have Republican colleagues who you think will get on board and understanding the climate of Washington right now, which I know is a big caveat, would support something like this?
I do. I know it's a really partisan environment. This hasn't been one of the really partisan issues. There are aspects of this that have been. So when we were crafting the bill, we wrote it with that in mind, knowing that in order for anything to pass, it's going to have bipartisan support. How can we craft a solution here that would work quickly, that would be significant, have a real impact, but also has a chance of having bipartisan support? Because without that third thing, it ain't ever going to happen, you know?
Yeah, what's the timeline for this? Explain sort of the sausage making that goes into a bill and getting it passed. What's next?
Well, I think for timeline, you have to think about the election coming up, and you have to be realistic that once you get a few months out from the election, probably isn't much substantial legislation that we're going to see out of Congress. So we've got a few months to get this done. I think if we're not done by midsummer, I think that's a big problem.
I'll also be talking to folks at the state level about this problem. What do you think, as a former state legislator yourself, what do you think is the state's role in helping out here?
The state plays a huge role, but this is an area where the state and the federal government have a real partnership. So there are other areas where it's almost completely on the state, like teacher pay is almost completely on the state. Early childhood is different. That's an area where historically the federal government really has stepped up and provided a lot of funding. The state relies on that very heavily.
Switching gears now, House Republicans finally releasing an aid bill this week for Israel and Ukraine. Do you think this is something that can finally get over the finish line?
I think so, but it's going to be really close, both in terms of votes and in terms of timing. So I'm on the Armed Services Committee. We had our top military commander in charge of our European forces come and testify before us last week. And basically he said, look, Ukraine is out of time and we have to make a decision. Are we going to resupply them with the two things they really need from us, being artillery shells and air defense interceptors? Those are the two key pieces of military hardware that they need to keep fighting and keep defending themselves. Or he said, we're going to watch as Russia conquers Ukraine. And given the history and given what we have witnessed as far as war crimes being committed by Russia, even against children, you have to envision that being part of the consequence here. This isn't just a political matter where all of a sudden Ukraine becomes a part of Russia. We would expect Russia to commit massive atrocities as they have so far during the course of the war. And this general said, are we really prepared to watch that happen, knowing that they could defend themselves if we resupplied them?
Since the Cold War, I mean, Russia has seemed to be a unifying thing here in America that people of all political stripes sort of could rally against, for lack of a better term. Have you been surprised at sort of the lack of unity, especially for folks on the other side of the aisle from you?
A little bit. And, what I hear from a lot of folks, including some constituents, is they're basically concerned about money. They don't like the idea of spending this money. And I fully understand that. What I wish more people understood was that almost all of that money is being spent in the United States. Basically, we are giving them a credit card with a certain amount of money on it, and they are turning around and using it to purchase from us our old supply of air defense interceptors and artillery shells. We then use that money to modernize our supply. So nobody likes spending money, but given how it's being spent, given why it's being spent, and given the consequences that we are all going to witness if it is not, I think it's a very strong case.
And it's an important distinction that I haven't heard enough people make. A little bit of intrigue there at the U.S. Capitol. What's going to happen to the Speaker of the House?
I'm just going to make a prediction based on very little. I think he's going to hold on. I think the idea that we would be on our third speaker here in one Congress is absurd. I don't think it serves anyone's interest. It certainly doesn't serve the interest of the majority party to have that level of instability. I think there's a lot of internal pushback within the majority party in the House to the idea of firing the speaker. Even if they vote against him on Ukraine or anything else, I think there's a ton of pushback, and I would be disappointed and surprised if they fire the speaker yet again.
Do you think there's an appetite among Democrats to quote unquote save him? No, you don't support him politically, but save him and support him in the job currently?
There may be. I mean, we'll see what the details of that would be. I think the question is going to be, as it was with the last speaker, is it mathematically possible? Because you could have a situation where every Democrat who votes for the Republican speaker means he loses another 2 Republicans, because the idea for Republicans of a speaker, their leader, being there by virtue of Democratic votes is going to be objectionable to them, to put it mildly.
Where do you see your district is going to be largely Republican going forward? You're going to, of course, running in another race going into the fall. What do you see happening in the House over the course of the next year?
I think we've got another few months where we can actually do some lawmaking, and then I think everyone's going to go into campaign mode. So if something hasn't passed by mid-July, I think it probably is going to be saved for the next Congress. And I think this week or the next 2 weeks may be the last big round of lawmaking that we do as far as the really big stuff. Everything after this may be smaller issues.
All right, all eyes on Washington for the next few weeks. Congressman Jeff Jackson. Congressman, thanks for coming on. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Up next on Flashpoint, the push from state lawmakers to help get child care centers the money they deserve.